we talk about it every year. There's certain players that might get traded at the deadline, but it might just completely crater their fantasy value where, it's not always the case, especially if you're going from a bad team to a good team. It doesn't always have a positive impact on your fantasy value. So I tried to find 5 names of guys I think could get moved that could actually be beneficial for their fantasy value. And obviously, we don't have the crystal ball. We don't know exactly where these guys are going to go, but we're going to give you some ideas and hopefully we do see some big trades over the next few weeks and hopefully some positive fantasy impact. So most of these guys are either available on the waiver wire or are around 50-60% owned and might be available in your wire or somebody that you might have. Or if your fantasy trade deadline hasn't happened yet, you could maybe approach that owner for a trade for these players as well. So we will start at the very top of Frank's trade targets board with Brock Nelson of the New York Islanders. He's a strict center, but just 54% owned right now. Obviously Nelson's been in a pretty comfortable situation with the Islanders for many years. He's put up some solid numbers. His totals as of late have still been pretty strong as well. He's got 16 points in his last 17 games, 7 goals during that span. So, hard for him to really replicate that where he goes next. But there are a few spots, and I think the one that sticks out is in Winnipeg. They've kind of been looking for a 2C for a while. We saw with Sean Monahan a little bit last season, but like Nelson could fit right in on that second line with Cole Perfetti and Nikolai Ehlers, both who are having tremendous seasons. And I do think that moving to a team like that could still boost Brock Nelson's fantasy value if he ends up, in that spot on that line on a higher scoring team than what the Islanders are. I think he had, a pretty good start to the season, fell apart a little bit in the middle. He's picking things back up again now. But this is a guy that I think if he's available under wire, if you can get him for cheap right now, is a guy that could actually see a boost in fantasy value, in a week or two now from now. So tremendous first name on the guy as well, Brock. Always got to give a shout out to them. But Beebs, what do you think here with Brock Nelson and his value coming up here?
See, if we would have did this show pre-Four Nations, I actually think I would have been a little bit lower on Brock Nelson. But just seeing how he could adapt to that lineup and kind of play as a role player on the United States team there and actually look quite good at it. It encouraged me for where he could go and for the success he could have on a good team. I'm right there with you. I think if he goes to the right team, it could definitely help him. We saw him average 36 goals in three seasons between 2021 through 2024. That's pretty incredible. That's some high-end fantasy production, and we like that. Obviously, this year his value's down a little bit more, but with that value going down, he's actually upped his time on ice. So we've seen him put up those 36 goals with only 18 minutes a night. I think if he does get traded to the right team, he can continue to push with 18 a night. I do like your Winnipeg choice there. I don't want to mention it, but Colorado's in need of a 2C right now. I don't know if they have the perfect thing they can give up, but if Nelson does end up there, I do think he gains value. We've also seen Carolina talking about needing another center. That's another team where I think he could go that he could get better. Certainly a guy, as you mentioned, cooking right now, 16 in his last 17. So you can afford to kind of just have him on your bench. And he played 24 minutes 2 nights ago. So if he's playing on the Islanders in the meantime, that's totally cool. Because if he's getting 24 minutes of ice, you're going to enjoy it. So I'm cool on Brock Nelson. I think it's a nice grab right now, and someone who it'll be very interesting. But I assume he's going to go to a team that really needs him. So when he does, could be in for a little bit better. But I need to see him on a top power play too, though. That could definitely sway whether I like him or not. But D, how do you feel about the coolest Brock that we've talked about, that we've mentioned today?
Yeah, sure. I think the power play time is probably going to be hard to come by, but he's gotten by this season well enough as is on the second unit with the Islanders. And if you have to think if he's moving to one of these contending teams, that the 5v5 production should get a boost. To me, it just depends where he lands. Like, I think Colorado makes a lot of sense. The one thing that we need to mention as well is Nelson has, I believe it's a 16-team no trade list. As we know from those player surveys, Winnipeg's a pretty popular team to have on your no trade list. Even if they're there, obviously he has the option to waive it. And with him being a UFA at the end of the year, maybe he's more inclined to just go play a few months in Winnipeg and take a run at a Stanley Cup. But that is something to kind of keep in mind here. I think Colorado does make a lot of sense. And to me, that would be like the ideal fit, because if he goes to Winnipeg, he's almost certainly not going to be on that top power play unit. And we know that bottom six, particularly the Lowry line, is still going to see a lot of minutes. So I would expect his ice time to drop if he moves to Winnipeg. He's going to get better exposure at 5v5 for sure. But to me, it's maybe more a best case. We're looking at like a wash with where he's been this year. And he's been good enough, right? Like hasn't been as great as he's been in years past, but especially in leagues where you're getting credit or additional value from the shot volume, he's certainly managed to sustain a good amount of fantasy value. I've held on him in a couple of leagues all year and certainly recommend doing so just at least through the deadline and seeing kind of how this all plays out. I think Carolina would be trickier. I think they only got about 500K in cap space right now. The Islanders will almost certainly retain on this trade, which is the other thing to keep in mind that's going to make this a lot more doable for teams. But he's got a $6 million hit, so that's going to half it to about $3 million. So maybe the Hurricanes would, look to get a third team in there to retain twice back and get it down to 1.5. And yeah, obviously if they do flip Rantanen, like it's kind of been rumored they might look at doing, that opens up a ton of cap space as well. But the other team I think that could make sense is Tampa. I think they would love to be in a position to kind of skirt Cirelli back down to the third line and just really deepen out their lineup. So I think that's a team to keep an eye on. They have enough cap space, about $5 million right now, where they could certainly afford just to take him at the $3 million half. But yeah, the Islanders have all 3 retainment spots right now. He's the UFA at the end of the year. So certainly anyone that they offload, they'll be looking or be willing to retain and, get some additional value back that way. So it's going to be interesting. But if I had to guess, I would say it probably comes down to Colorado or Winnipeg. I think the no trade list is going to come into play here. But I do think best case scenario for him is moving to Colorado because I think there's a chance that he sticks on the top power play unit there if that's how it all plays out.
Yeah, I think another team to throw in the mix. I don't know how much they're going to be in the rental market, but the Red Wings, right? They just traded Ville Husso. They got like $14 million coming up. Andrew Kopp out. They're going to be looking for a center if they're, Steve Yzerman's going to want to make the playoffs this year. So they're another team that's probably going to be in the mix for a center as well. Tons of cap space to do some damage there as well. The other thing though, too, Brock Nelson, only 1 power play goal this year and 1 power play assist. The real massive drop off in power play production is really what's kind of held him back so far this season. Currently on pace for just 53 points after 75 points 2 years ago and 69 points last year. So, the power play hasn't been to his friend this year, regardless. So wherever he goes, hopefully a little bit more power play production will be along the way because there has been nothing to speak of thus far. Seth Jones is next, 67% owned defenseman in Chicago. He is currently number 5 on Frank's trade targets board. Obviously, he would have to land in the right spot, as all these guys will, for a major fantasy upgrade since he's already playing 24.5 minutes in Chicago, also on the top power play unit. But I think, maybe just moving from the 4th lowest scoring team in the league could be enough to boost his fantasy value. He also carries a no trade list, and he's going to be able to pick and choose where he wants to go, but he's been fairly outspoken as of late, wanting to move it on from this Chicago team and kind of whatever's going on around that team lately. So yeah, he looks like a guy that's likely to be moved. Obviously, massive contract, a lot of term left. It's going to be a lot trickier of a contract to move. But, I think that the Blackhawks have already said that they're talking to him and trying to work with him and trying to facilitate a deal. Just to give you an idea, he is signed through 2030 with a $9.5 million cap hit. So, it's going to be a little bit more of a tricky trade to facilitate. I'm not 100% sure it happens this year or this before the deadline. Maybe it's more of a draft floor trade, but regardless, still number 5 on Frank's trade target board. So he's expecting them to garner a lot of attention. D, what do you think here? Obviously, I think it's a lot easier to look at Brock Nelson and some center needy teams and find the right landing spot. It's a lot more difficult to find the proper landing spot for Seth Jones. But, I think he's got enough value right now where it doesn't really matter if he gets traded or not. He's fine, but he could see a boost if he does get moved.
Yeah, I don't know. I have a pretty skeptical that this trade happens, as are you, Brock. It's just so hard to move that big of a cap hit in season. And this is a guy with 5 years left on his deal. So you have to think that retaining is almost certainly out of the question. I don't know. Chicago does some surprising things sometimes, but I would be shocked if they're retaining any sort of significant salary on this deal. One, just holding up a retainment slot for that long isn't, ideal, but also if you're going all the way up to 50% of this cap hit, who knows where this team's at in 5 years? They might want that cap space, $4.5 million's worth. And even with the cap going up. So yeah, I think to me, this feels more like an off-season trade when we have a better idea of where the cap's going to be at next year. And there's not a whole lot of places available that's they quite clearly have an opening to run their top power play units. So I don't know. I don't think this will factor too much into this fantasy hockey season. I think it'll, like you said, probably more likely one that moves on in the offseason. You never know, of course, but I just have a hard time kind of imagining scenarios or teams that are going to be able to, one, have the cap space to acquire him, and then at least from our perspective, be in a spot where he has the opportunity to command a pretty sizable role, particularly with the man advantage, which we know provides so much fantasy value for defensemen. The one team that I think could be interesting to keep an eye on is the Rangers. They have about 12.5 million in cap space right now. Obviously, Adam Fox just went down for what sounds like almost the rest of the regular season. So that'll be an interesting one, and maybe one that could potentially get done. But I don't know if they'd want to tie up that much money long term in Seth Jones. And I think they'd have to do some maneuvering to make sure that they're under again next year. So to me, that's the one spot, though, that it's like they could potentially acquire him without any retainment or anything like that going on. And there's quite clearly a need right now for him, for someone to quarterback their top power play unit. So that is maybe the one situation to keep an eye on, or the one situation where he could actually see a boost to his fantasy value.
Yeah, it's pretty bold to demand a trade when you're making 9.5 million, or not demand, I guess ask for one when you're making 9.5, because like you guys have mentioned, there's just so many limited spots that he can go if he does get traded, hypothetically. Fantasy wise, I'm kind of on the train too of I don't really think that he improves his perform or his fantasy quality much from there. We've seen 27 points in 41 games, but he's done that with only 78 shots on goal. He's shooting a career high 9%. He's normally a 5% career shooter. If he does go to another team, I would expect those shots on goal to go down with the ice time. And if that goes down with the ice time and he has a little bit less luck, we're not getting much production out of him in the goal category. He might make up for it with a couple more secondary assists. As you mentioned, Chicago's absolutely terrible at scoring. So if he goes somewhere that can put the puck in the net a little bit easier, he might get a few more secondaries. But for me, it's just not enough to expect the needle to be pushed for any excitement. So Seth Jones, I'm sorry, but I think of all the other names on here, that he's probably the one I'm least excited about if they were to move. I don't think it's going to get much better than, this is hilarious to say, but then being on the fifth lowest scoring team in the NHL because he's just getting that quality time. And yeah,
I laugh at him demanding a trade just because he's like, I want to go somewhere to win. It's like, well, then maybe you should have signed an 8-year deal with the team that won 28 games. Like, you wanted that bag, you wanted to get paid, and now you're stuck in Chicago on a terrible team. Like, you made that bed. Now you're like, oh, I want to go somewhere. It's hilarious. But anyways, let's move on to number 3. He's actually number 9 on Frank's trade targets board, and that's Dylan Cozens of the Buffalo Sabres, currently just 21% rosters. Now we're getting to the guys that you could easily pick up off the waiver wire. It's pretty easy to see his value increasing if he lands with one of these teams that needs a second center. We've already laid out 4 or 5 of them. A team like I already mentioned, the Red Wings comes to mind. If they are a team that's willing to pull the trigger, I don't know if they're really going to be in the rental market, but they could be a team that's looking to add for now and the future with all of their cap space. And he could wind up on a line with Patrick Kane and Alex DeBrincat, which would obviously be a tremendous fit and a good spot for him fantasy value wise. But obviously not a sure thing. But he's only has not played over 16 minutes in his last 4 or 5 games. So things aren't really looking great in Buffalo right now. Just 1 goal in his last 12 games. It's been a really disappointing season. And, to speak quite frankly, as a Detroit Red Wings fan, like I think the idea of acquiring Dylan Cozens is pretty interesting. I like the prospect. I like his game, but like he does have a pretty big ticket. Was it $7.1 million per year? And he's a player that we've seen his production really fall off since 2023 when he had 31 goals and 37 assists. Followed up with just 18 goals and 47 points the next game, and currently just with 11 goals and 19 assists for 30 points in 56 games this year. So, I do think that it is a bit of a scary trade because I don't think he's going to come cheap at all. But he is a guy that if maybe it's just the coaching in Buffalo and it's something that you can unlock, and he's still just 23 years old. So I think it's an intriguing trade piece. Frank mentioned it in his article saying basically no one's name has been rumored more than Dylan Cozens so far this season. Obviously, we had those couple Vancouver Canucks players and JT Miller and Elias Pettersson stealing headlines for a month or two there, but Dylan Cozens has been basically rumored all season long, so it's going to be interesting to see if he ends up actually getting moved. Beebs, we'll go back to you here. What are you thinking about with Dylan Cozens heading towards the deadline?
I think we can almost regurgitate kind of what I said or what we said for Brock Nelson. It's another center that's coming through here. And if he lands on one of these top 5, top 10 teams that scores like they do, that value is going to go up. Just to kind of give you guys what Dylan Cozens can bring, though, to a fantasy night. Last night, he played 15 minutes, 4 shots on goals, 7 hits. He can do it all across the board. And if he can kind of reopen that up, like we saw, as Brock mentioned, 68 points where he had a 30-30 season in 2022-23, if he can reopen that up with his newfound ability to hit and his overall ability to shoot that he's always had, I think that he could kind of reopen his game. But I mean, at this point, you're taking a chance on that. He's really given us no reason to think that he, is that 70-point player in the last couple of years just because of his production here. So you are taking a chance. But I think the ceiling is incredibly high on this guy. It's very rare that you see a player like this at this age who has this scoring ability, who's basically getting just not thrown away, but just sent away like this. Like they clearly had value in him when they gave him the $7.1 million contract and thought that he was worth something. And now here we are. But I think that Cozens very much, and I will, maybe a bold choice, but I think if Cozens goes to maybe if he goes in the same position as Brock Nelson, say Nelson goes to Winnipeg, Cozens goes to Colorado, or vice versa, I think Cozens has the better production just strictly for fantasy wise. But that's just, that's a throw in the bag and a total guess. D, how do you feel about a guy who shares a name with you? Now I'm hoping the next guy's name is Mike, because if not, I'm going to lose it.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is a trickier trade to get done just because he's got 3 years left on his deal. So retaining is a bit trickier, and you're really going to have to give up some value. It's not like, we've seen it before. Like I think McCabe a few years ago when he got traded to the Leafs, it might have just been 2 years, but so 3 years, it has happened before at the very least, unlike, the 5-year retainment.
Just to clarify, he has 5 years left on his deal. He's in the second year of a 7-year deal. 5 years left, 3 years left, and then before a modified no trade kicks in.
Right. Okay. So it's not happening then. There's not going to be any retainment there. So again, that just makes it trickier, right? Your teams that are going to look at acquiring him outside of the Jets, like the Jets are really the one where if you're moving to a contending team where we could potentially see a boon in his value, they have the room to get it done. Brock's Red Wings have the room to get it done. And, I think there'd be more teams that are going to be open to him and not just the contenders, right? Because this is a guy with obviously some long-term upside, maybe a bit of a project with where his game's been at the last couple of seasons. So I think, in that sense, a team like the Red Wings, it does make a lot more sense where, yeah, they'd love to get in this year and it would make them a better team this year, but they're also probably looking more towards the next 3 or 4 years. And so he kind of fits in with that mold a little bit better. Maybe even like Vancouver might make sense, right? As they kind of look to kind of continually retool and reshape their roster after the Miller trade. So I don't know. This one's interesting to me, but again, it's not a small cap hit. To me, it's obviously going to pretend what's out there for them at the time, but I think there'd be a lot more competition for his services in the offseason when you have teams that are, all have the capability of overhauling and retooling their rosters. Contracts are expiring and they can a lot easier fit in this $7.1 million cap hit onto their roster. So again, this one I'm a little bit more skeptical that it gets done, and even with all the rumors, because again, I'm not sure it helps the Sabres all that much to move him either, because I think he's the type of player that makes sense for them to be acquiring right now, right? So if it's gotten to this point though, he's obviously fallen out of favor to a certain degree. So I don't know. It's an interesting one to watch. More skeptical that it gets done though. I just think there's a lot of moving parts that have to happen for it to make sense. So we shall see. I think, again, it just makes more sense to kind of hold off and move him in the offseason when there's going to be a lot more potential suitors.
And the last name we are going to talk about, he is number 13 on Frank's trade targets board, and that is not Mike Palmieri, but Kyle Palmieri, who is just 15% rostered, right wing eligible for the Islanders at the moment. It's going to be so interesting because I feel like I haven't really seen the Islanders in this position under Lou Lamoriello, like to be just full blown sellers and get rid of these guys and expiring contracts. And he kind of just operates different than any other GM in the league. Like I wouldn't be shocked if he just doesn't trade either one of them and just they both walk in free agency, but they're on the trade targets board because they should be moved. I think there's obviously a few landing spots for Palmieri, where his value could realistically go up. I think the one team that stands out to me as being really winger needy in a place where he's played before is New Jersey. That's a team that, when you look at their lineup on dailyfaceoff.com, is a team that needs a top 6 scoring winger. Tomas Tatar is playing up there right now. They've really found to like Timo Meier more in that third line role. So adding a guy like Palmieri that they're familiar with might be a nice move. They got Andre Plot on the top line. He's fit in pretty well. But this is a team that has aspirations of winning a cup, and I do think that they're a team that's probably going to try to make some moves here at the deadline. And that's the type of situation where if Palmieri gets moved to the Devils, either landing on a line with whether it be with Jack Hughes or potentially Nico Hischier would be an upgrade for him. Obviously him and Brock Nelson have formed a pretty good partnership over the years. Palmieri, not a guy that really ever carries, long-term fantasy value, but always a guy that gets hot and gets streaky and scores a lot of goals in bunches. And that's kind of been the case as of late. He's been playing much better since the middle of January, 5 goals, 11 points in his last 14 games. So he carries some value already, similar to Brock Nelson. But I do think if he lands in the right spot, could be somebody that, continues to see strong fantasy value moving forward. And if he lands in the perfect spot, could really be a guy that's kind of like a league winning type pickup down the line, because he can get hot and he can score a lot of goals. D, maybe pump the brakes on it a little bit. You know me, I'm a big Kyle Palmieri stan. What do you think about his potential upside in the next
round? I think what you brought up about Lou is interesting. I still think in his mind, it should make sense to move them, but I think the ask is going to be different than the typical first in a prospect for, not that I think Palmieri would, bring that haul in, but certainly Brock Nelson in any given year would, in terms of being the top trade target on the board. That's generally a pretty generic return. I think he's going to want assets that can help him next season, right? I think it'd be kind of silly to just let these guys walk in free agency, as you said, Brock. Maybe he feels there's a good chance of re-signing them, maybe Nelson in particular. But I do think they'll be looking for, some younger-ish pieces, but guys that they feel can help them in the near future. Maybe they just look to take the picks and flip those for those kind of parts in the offseason. Who knows, right? But you would think they're not making the playoffs this year. They're unrestricted free agents coming up. Any other GM in the league would be no doubt shopping these guys around and be looking to offload them for the best offer available. A couple things to keep in mind. $5 million cap hit. Again, they have all 3 retainment slots, so that will almost certainly factor in here. I think the Devils have somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million available, so not something they could do straight up, but we're only talking about realistically moving one contract on their roster to be able to free up the space to make that happen. So I do think that's a spot that could happen and make sense, and one of the better spots for him to end up, just in terms of, I think there's some need there in the top 6. But again, at the same time, this is a team that has options further down the lineup in Timo Meier and Dawson Mercer that are arguably maybe worthy of a look in those spots as well. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. It's just so hard. We talk about this every year, but there's so few guys that actually end up moving into new situations midseason that are beneficial for their fantasy value. And I think people that are listening to this are kind of getting that sense. We're kind of hyper fixating on 1 or 2 landing spots for each of these guys that could really boost their fantasy value. And obviously teams are going to be looking to acquire these guys just to deepen out their roster and, not necessarily be sliding them into bigger roles. So, again, the only other thing I want to bring up, 16 team, no trade list. So that could obviously come into play. I'm sure Winnipeg's on there, but New Jersey, maybe not. He's been there before. It would make sense that he'd be willing to go back there, obviously really close to where he's at in Long Island right now already. So relocating, all those real life factors wouldn't be an issue. So to me, that spot makes a lot of sense, and hopefully it happens because, I think this is a guy, like you said, Brock, that would certainly be worth the pickup if he's seen those minutes and has proven himself to be a worthy contributor on the power play as well over the years.
Yeah, another team to bring up, I think, is the Edmonton Oilers, right? I don't necessarily know. The Jeff Scarra experience hasn't really worked out the way they thought it would. Right now they got Matt Savoy coming up from the AHL to play on Leon Draisaitl's wing. Vasily Podkolzin spent a lot of time in the left side there with Draisaitl lately. I think that's a team that's, again, championship aspirations. They're going to be pushing all their chips in the middle of the table, and adding another scoring winger to the mix should help. I don't know if it will help or if it will change anything. They've barely even tried to use Jeff Skinner, but it'll be interesting to see if what that team does at the deadline. Any final thoughts here on Kyle Palmieri, Beeps?
Matt, you snagged. I was going Canadian teams for my guesses for him. I was going Edmonton, and then another one here, boys. Calgary. Calgary's currently in a playoff position right now. Their top six is a little bit weaker. If they have a few things that they can move, younger talent that they proven that they'll do or that they'll make trades before with Philly. We've seen obviously Morgan Frost deal go down there. And yeah, I just think that's a team where he would fit in and he could potentially find power play time. Unfortunately, it may come at the cost of our boy Matt Coronato if that does happen, if he were to end up there. But I do like that one. Palmieri's actually, I think he's one of the more intriguing names on here, and it's more just because of, as we mentioned, just the position that he does occupy. Center, obviously, top six center spot is a little bit harder to fill on one of these better teams. But if you're filling a top six winger spot, there's more than likely a spot for a guy like Kyle Palmieri on one of these teams. So I do like keeping an eye on him. I personally wouldn't be grabbing him yet, but keeping him around is definitely a good call. He's a 30 goal scorer, as we know, and Brock absolutely loves him. So I would love to see Brock pop off about him a little bit more, but on a different team than the Islanders for once.
Yeah, oh man, if he gets in a good spot, I don't know if I'll ever stop talking about Kyle Palmieri's potential fantasy upside. Okay, that's going to do it for that segment of the show. If you want to check out the entire trade targets list from Frank Saravalli, that is available on dailyfaceoff.com. We are obviously going to have tons of coverage leading up to and of the trade deadline. We always do a show after the trade deadline as well, recapping all of these moves, talking about this exact thing. Whose value went up, whose value went down. And boys, it's not always the player that gets traded whose value goes up, but sometimes that trade creates an opportunity within that team. Somebody moves up the lineup and then their fantasy value goes up. So there's a lot of moving pieces around this time of the season. And obviously dailyfaceoff.com and the DFO Fantasy Podcast will have you covered from all different angles. So thank you guys so much for tuning in. We'll see you guys back here next week.